The story that I'm about to tell you really happened. These events happened in 1996, but the names and details of the story have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. Amy Johnson was a woman who loved puzzles and problems. As a high school math teacher in the quiet town of Benton, Oregon, she was known for her bright smile and sharp mind. She was someone who always had an interesting riddle to share with her students. Her life revolved around her job and her students. Each day started the same: a mug of black coffee, the quiet hum of her house on the edge of town, and then the walk to school, where she was greeted by the energetic chatter of her students. Her classes were always lively, filled with laughter and learning. After work, she'd retreat to her cozy home, prepare a simple meal, and then lose herself in a book or a complex crossword puzzle. The town itself was a tranquil place, surrounded by lush green woods that changed colors with the seasons. People were friendly, and life was calm. Summers were for picnics and outdoor movies, winters for warm fires and close-knit community gatherings. One could say that Amy's life was simple, but she was content. She enjoyed the serene rhythm of her days, the close-knit community around her, and her place within it. She loved her quiet corner of the world, not knowing that it was soon to be disturbed, that a storm was brewing on the horizon. For now, though, the sun still set in a blaze of colors, painting the Oregon sky with shades of orange, pink, and gold. As she often did, Amy sat on her porch, watching the sunset and savoring the peace of her tranquil town, lost in thoughts of the next day's puzzles. The next day started just as any other. Amy enjoyed her morning coffee, taught her classes, and exchanged friendly conversations with her students and colleagues. As the school day ended, she gathered her things and started the familiar walk home, not knowing it would be her last for a while. As she reached the edge of the town, where the houses gave way to dense, towering trees, she noticed a rustling in the undergrowth. Thinking it was a stray dog or a squirrel, she didn't give it much thought. But then, a figure emerged from the shadowy depths of the woods. He was a man of intimidating stature, his face obscured by the failing light. Before Amy could react, he was upon her. A cloth, soaked in something strong and dizzying, was pressed over her mouth. Her world began to spin, and the peaceful town she knew faded into darkness. She woke up in the back of a moving vehicle, her head pounding. Through the rear window, she could only see dark trees passing by, their gnarled silhouettes illuminated by the eerie glow of the moon. Fear gripped her heart as the car delved deeper into the unknown woods. After what felt like an eternity, the car came to a halt. The man, now revealed to be middle-aged with a stern expression, dragged her out. Amy squinted through her fear, taking in her new surroundings. She was facing an old mansion, its grandeur faded with time, standing ominously among the thick trees. It was as if the house itself was a living, breathing entity, shrouded in darkness and holding secrets behind its aged walls. As the man, who she would later know as Richard, pushed her through the front door, the last thing she saw was the town's lights flickering in the distance. A cold sense of dread settled over her as the door creaked shut behind her, signaling the beginning of her harrowing ordeal. She was now a captive in the heart of the woods, miles away from her peaceful life. In the heart of the shadowy mansion, Amy was confined to a sparse room, her world shrunk to the cold stone walls surrounding her. Richard, her captor, was as enigmatic as he was unsettling. His scarce words hung heavy in the air, each one laced with a veiled threat. The first thing she noticed about Richard was his gaze, cold, calculating, and devoid of empathy. Whenever he stepped into her room, his eyes swept the space, assessing every detail with a predator's precision. It wasn't just observation, it was control, a constant reminder that he was in charge, that he held her life in his hands. Food was delivered thrice a day, each meal a silent transaction. Richard would place the tray on the table, his movements mechanical, impersonal. Yet, there was a perverse pleasure in his eyes, a satisfaction in seeing her in this captive state, forced to rely on him for basic needs. The control he had over her wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a slow and deliberate assault on her spirit. Richard was cruel, yes, but he was also methodical. He never missed a beat, his routine as consistent as the dread that filled the mansion. His actions were calculated, his habits predictable. The jangling keys on his belt, the heavy boots echoing down the corridor, the tobacco scent clinging to his clothes, each detail imprinted on her mind, each a possible key to her escape. Yet, amid this grim routine, Richard's true intentions remained shrouded. His interactions held an undercurrent of something more sinister. There were lingering looks, unsettling smiles, hints dropped casually, a slowly tightening noose. Despite the fear, Amy's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information, painting a picture of her captor and her prison. The mansion was no longer just a building. It was a puzzle to solve, a maze to navigate. Richard was not just a captor. He was the antagonist in her story, the monster she must outsmart. Fear was her constant companion, but hope hadn't left her side. The situation was dire, yet Amy held on to her determination, her resolve to escape. Time had a strange way of stretching in captivity. Each day was a mirror image of the one before, a monotonous rhythm that dulled the senses. Yet, Amy didn't allow herself to be lulled into complacency. She began to study the mansion, to listen to its secrets, to use her captive environment to her advantage. She started to memorize the sounds around her, the distant echo of a grandfather clock somewhere in the mansion, its chime consistent and timely. The haunting creak of wooden floors as Richard moved around the house, a chilling serenade to her captive life. The distant hoot of an owl from the surrounding woods, a lonely call to the free world. Amy began to notice the smaller details, the things that hid in plain sight. The way her door creaked at a certain angle, the small draft that hinted at unseen passages, the faint outline of what seemed like a trapdoor under the worn-out carpet in her room. Each detail, no matter how small, was a piece of the puzzle she was determined to solve. Richard's routine was another constant she used to her advantage. She noted his habits, the exact times he brought her meals, the days he seemed more restless, the times he left the mansion, and the times he returned. She watched him closely when he was around, gathering clues from his mannerisms, the way he reacted to certain situations, the subtle changes in his behavior. She noticed the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way his gaze lingered longer than necessary, the growing obsession behind his eyes. All the while, she played the part of a terrified captive, hiding her sharp intelligence behind a facade of fear. As the days turned into weeks, Amy continued her silent study of the mansion and its cruel master. The place that once instilled paralyzing fear in her was slowly becoming a labyrinth she was learning to navigate. The mansion's oppressive silence was punctuated only by the consistency of Richard's routine. Yet, a shift in his demeanor started to taint the predictability. Amy noted a dark, unspoken hunger in his eyes. His intentions, masked until now, began to emerge, revealing a horrifying blend of perverse desire and monstrous appetite. Richard's visits to her room grew more frequent, his gaze lingering with a disconcerting intensity. His conversations were sprinkled with subtle innuendo. He would comment on her appearance, his gaze lingering longer than necessary, his words hinting at an unspoken desire. Amy was a captive, yes, but she was starting to realize she might also be an object of a depraved fascination. Yet, there was something else, something even more disturbing. Richard's discussions often veered toward strange topics: food, hunting, the satisfaction derived from fresh meat. His eyes would glint with an unsettling delight as he described the pleasure of the hunt, the thrill of making a kill. The meat he served her at mealtimes was unidentifiable, its scent foreign and unsettling. His words, spoken with a twisted glee, hinted at an abnormal diet. "It's an acquired taste," he once said, "one you might learn to appreciate." His laughter that followed was not of amusement, but a dark promise. The reality of her situation became clearer and more terrifying. Richard was not merely her captor, he was a predator. She was his captive, an object of his twisted desires. Despite her escalating fear, Amy refused to succumb to despair. She had to escape, not just from Richard's control, but from the gruesome fate that awaited her if she didn't. She watched his habits, noted his distractions, and traced the patterns in his routine. Every minute detail about Richard and the mansion was a potential tool for her survival. The stakes were now greater than ever before. Fear had a new, horrifying face, but so did Amy's resolve. She was not just a victim, she was a survivor. Amy knew she must use her wit and strength to escape from Richard's monstrous clutches. With each passing day, The mansion's walls seemed to close in a little more. But rather than feeling cornered, Amy felt ready. The unfolding revelations about Richard's perverse tendencies had ignited a fierce determination within her. Each horrifying discovery strengthened her resolve, making her more desperate to escape the monstrous fate that Richard had in store. Every waking moment, she spent meticulously observing Richard's patterns and studying the mansion's layout. She noticed the way Richard's eyes grew heavy after lunch, a brief period where his vigilance slightly wavered. She discovered that the old grandfather clock echoed throughout the mansion, effectively masking other sounds. She learned the exact floorboard outside her room that creaked, and how to step over it without making a noise. While Richard was away on his hunting trips, Amy took the opportunity to explore her room further. Beneath the worn-out carpet, she found a trapdoor. It was locked, but she noticed the rusted hinges and the crumbling wood. She believed that she could force it open, given the right tool and the perfect timing. Through the small window in her room, she saw Richard carry in a large body-shaped object from the trunk of his car. The body was covered in black trash bags. It was then she realized with certainty how he procured his twisted meals. She also observed that he'd return home just as the sun was setting, providing her a rough estimate of his hunting schedule. Every piece of information, every observation, was a valuable puzzle piece to Amy. She began to craft a plan. She'd force open the trapdoor when Richard was on his hunting trip, sneak out of her room when he was having his post-lunch rest, and finally, escape through the woods during the late afternoon when he was away. Amy knew that her plan was fraught with danger, but it was her only chance of escape. The stakes were high, but she was ready. Amy spent the next few days preparing for her escape. Every step had to be perfect. There was no room for error. The mansion's eerie silence echoed her resolve, a testament to her determination. One morning, while Richard was away on his gruesome hunt, Amy tried to pry open the trapdoor. Using a loose nail she'd managed to pry from her bed frame, she worked at the rusted hinges and the decaying wood. Her hands bled from the effort, and fear gnawed at her mind, but she persisted. After what felt like hours, the trapdoor finally gave way to reveal a dark, damp tunnel leading into the unknown. Amy explored the tunnel as much as she could, guided by the dim light from her room. It was narrow, filled with the stench of dampness and decay. She had to crawl on her hands and knees, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, a dark abyss that promised freedom or doom. As she returned to her room, Amy saw that the sun was starting to set. Richard would be back soon. She hastily covered the trapdoor with the carpet and cleaned up any signs of her efforts. She felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but it was paired with a glimmer of hope. Her plan was coming together. Over the next few days, Amy familiarized herself with the tunnel. She calculated how long it would take her to crawl through it, and how to navigate its winding turns. She also found a loose brick in the wall of her room. She managed to dislodge it and decided to use it as a weapon, if necessary. Amy rehearsed her escape plan in her mind over and over, ironing out any flaws, preparing herself for any unexpected complications. The mansion that once symbolized her captivity was now her training ground, the place where she transformed from a helpless victim into a hopeful survivor. The night before her planned escape, Amy couldn't sleep. She lay on her cold bed, listening to the mansion's eerie silence. She thought of the unknowns, the dangers, and the chance of freedom that lay ahead. She felt fear, but stronger still was her resolve. The darkness of the mansion was not as terrifying as the darkness within Richard. As dawn broke, Amy steeled herself. It was time to face her fear, to escape from the mansion, to reclaim her life. The day of her escape had arrived. As dawn kissed the night goodbye, Amy took a deep breath. Her heart pounded in her chest as she removed the carpet covering the trapdoor. Her blood roared in her ears, the silence of the mansion amplifying her every movement. She started her descent into the damp tunnel. Every sound she made echoed in the confined space, adding to her sense of urgency. But she pushed on, the rough walls scraping against her skin, the stench of decay filling her lungs. After what felt like an eternity, she finally emerged on the other side of the tunnel, her heart pounding with relief. But her moment of respite was short-lived as she heard a car door slam. She knew Richard was back. She ran towards the woods, but as she reached the edge of the forest, a strong hand grabbed her. She turned around to face Richard. His face was a mask of fury, his grip painfully tight. He slammed her against a tree, his breath heavy, eyes flashing with a monstrous delight. Fear paralyzed her momentarily as Richard leaned closer, a sickening smirk on his face. He paused, seemingly taking a perverse pleasure in her vulnerability, his hand roughly pawing over her soft body. In this moment of Richard's distraction, Amy seized her opportunity. She reached out and grabbed Richard's testicles through his pants, squeezing with all the strength she had left. She felt his left testicle crush in her hand. Richard howled in pain and collapsed onto the ground. Amy didn't waste a moment. She wrenched herself free from his weakening grasp and picked up a fist-sized rock. Without hesitating, she smashed the rock onto the back of Richard's head, knocking him completely unconscious. With one last look at the monster that had tormented her, she sprinted towards the woods. The mansion disappeared behind her as she ran, every heartbeat a triumphant drum in her ears, every breath tasting like the sweet air of freedom. The world around her was a blur as she navigated through the trees, fear and adrenaline fueling her escape. But she didn't look back. She didn't stop. She was leaving the house of horror and the monster named Richard behind, racing towards survival. Dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and pink as Amy, trembling and covered in dirt, stumbled into the local police station. The tale she told shocked the officers to their core. The quiet town had been a backdrop for a living horror story. Amy described her captivity in the mansion hidden in the woods, her struggle for survival, and her terrifying encounter with Richard, a monster in human skin. The shock on the officers' faces mirrored her own as she recounted her horrific experiences. A team of officers was quickly dispatched to the mansion. As the patrol cars sped through the early morning, the town woke up to an unusual sight. The serene morning was pierced by the wail of sirens echoing through the woods, a grim sign of what was about to be unveiled. At the mansion, the officers found Richard, still incapacitated and whimpering in pain. His reign of terror was finally over as they handcuffed him, reading him his rights before the ambulance took him away. Richard, the monster who had ruled the mansion with an iron fist, was finally being made to face the consequences of his horrifying actions. As the police combed through the mansion and its surrounding woods, they uncovered a chilling sight. Scattered around the mansion, beneath the green canopy and the soft earth, lay an extensive graveyard. Skeletal remains, hidden away for years, bore silent testimony to Richard's horrendous deeds. Each unearthed bone sent a fresh wave of horror coursing through the town. Over the coming weeks and months, a number of cold cases from the surrounding towns were finally solved as the remains were identified. News of Richard's arrest and the bone-chilling discoveries at the mansion sent a shockwave through the town. Whispers of the mansion's haunting truths filled every corner, every home. The townspeople were horrified by the gruesome news that the skeletal remains showed signs of being butchered, with knife marks indicating that the flesh had been purposefully removed from the bones. The peaceful town had unknowingly harbored a real-life monster, and its tranquility was shattered by this harsh reality. Amy's ordeal was on everyone's lips. The townsfolk spoke of her courage, her survival, and her escape. The quiet math teacher was now the town's living hero. Her story was a chilling reminder of the horrors that had unfolded right under their noses. As Amy found herself at the center of attention, sympathy, and admiration, the town grappled with the chilling revelations. The town was forever marked by the horror that had taken place in the mansion in the woods. The veil of peace was torn away, revealing a chilling nightmare that would haunt the town forever.